Is using Mockito. So this is the another example we have for unit testing by using the Mockito to mock dependencies. So this case comes when we have unit test which may depends on some another classes that fetches data from the live web services or the local database or some another third party dependencies. So in this is inconvenient for few reasons. Calling live services or databases are slow down our text executions, and also a passing test might start failing if the web service or database returns unexpected results. So we are kind of dependent on someone else to behavior in controlling behavior of our test, which is known as a flaky test. So we are not sure this test will pass or fail because this is out of our control, and it is difficult to test all possible success and failure scenarios by using a live web services or a database, because we need to create multiple ways or we don't have a one way to pass those kind of generate those kind of different possibilities. So therefore, rather than relying on a live web service or a database, you can mock these dependencies. Mocks allow emulating a live web services or the database access and return specific results depending on a situation what we expect. Generally speaking, you can mock dependencies by creating an alternative implementation of a class. Write alternative implementation by hand or make use of Mockito or some other packages similar to that. The current examples we are focusing on has a few steps. One is set up the dependencies, create a function to test, create a test file which mocks the HTTP client, and write a test for each conditions and then run those testing. So in the first we are kind of setting those dependency. We go one by one over here, so it will be easy for us to follow along. So we are using the same code base we have from the previous. So now we need to add the HTTP dependency. So while we are adding the dependency, I am not adding the version number because it will take the latest possible version from the dependencies, and I am adding the Mockito, which will require later on to mock the things, and we need the build runner to generate the mock classes. Okay. Now to create a function to test, in this function we have the fetch album which fetch the data from internet, which is calling the API, and we use the HTTP client to get those data. And if the server returns the status code 200, we are getting the album from those JSON parsing, and if we are not, then we are just returning an exception. So this is the normal function. So I am just adding this function in one of our file. So maybe I am just copy this function and adding this function to mockdemo.dart, and I am adding this function over here, and for this imports I am import HTTP as HTTP, so it's HTTP client, and for album I don't have an album, but we can create those album by considering that we have we don't have that album class over here, but we can say we have a class like this, album, and it has from JSON which takes map string dynamic as an input and return album. Okay, static. Now JSON decode, we need to import the dart convert library to hash this. So I think this kind of status will work for us as of now. And now after getting those methods, we are just creating the test file, which is named like this way, mock demo test. So in this class we also don't need to use widget test, so that's fine, I am just ignoring, but we need to use Mockito. So for using the Mockito, we need to annotate the generate mock and HTTP client. So I am just generating the mock, and in classes I am just using the HTTP dot client, and for that as well I need to import the HTTP package over here. And now those are implemented, and now we can run the Flutter pub run build runner build to generate those mock classes. So once the mock classes will be generated, we can able to access their mock. Now as you see, the demo mock underscore mocks dot dat, and this file is generated. So now we can try to access the mock client in this example. So I am just creating final and the client equals to mock client. Okay, so now from this imports we have the mock client ready. So now as in response we are just checking we should get the album out of this. So when the client is required, client dot get method is called with this specific URI. We are just passing then when. Okay, for when we need to import the Mockito, then answer, it will require invocation or it's asynchronous function, and then in async I am returning http dot response, and then the status code 200 and body. In the body I am returning the simple JSON string which user ID and titles, and status code 200. These are the response I am returning when this URL is accessed. Now I am just calling the fetch album, final album equals to await fetch album, and I am using this mock client to pass those data, and inside the fetch album of client we are getting the album. So now I'm expecting the actual album we got is this, is another helper function, and we are taking its type, it should be album. And also optionally we can check the album.id is equals to 2, it should be 2 as here, and the album.title it should be mock. But for now I am just commenting out this line just running this test to see we are getting the correct album or not by passing these things. So it's a type of album, so this two condition is fixed. But now as we saw, we don't have these variables, so I am just defining these two variable over here, final id. id integer and the title string, number, final string title. Now generating the constructor for those things. Now I am just making is the required parameters and the named parameters instead of positional. So now id, I can say map of id is, maybe just for now let's ignore this, id let's pass 0 and title let's pass title. So this is the wrong implementation, but for now I just want you to show we can have a failing test by running this. So I am just running this test and it's failing because we are not getting the 2 and those data expected. You can see expected is 2 and actual is 0. So we are getting 0 always over here, but we are expecting the 2 value. So now I am just fixing those parsing. So we can say now map id is number, I think let's find if it is not giving us a warning, I am ignoring this, map title. Okay, so now I am trying to run again and we'll see if that passed the correct value. So now our test is getting passed, and this can cover our fetch albums first option when the status code is 200, but we are not getting the another options covered when the exception are throwing. So in this case I am just using the mock client, and when we access this album 1, we are just kind of returning the response 404, and our fetch album should throw the exception. So I am just writing the test so you can have a better idea instead of copy pasting. Okay, so test function I am just giving the descriptions. What descriptions? Throws and exceptions if http call completes with an error, throws an exception if http call completes with an error. So it's a final client, mock client. So we are just mocking the client, and when our client dot get method called with URI, which specified URI, let's say this URI, then answer, what answer we expect? Async answers first, http dot response status code 400, exception I have just written, let's see, not found. Okay, not found. So now when we call the method, we expect it throws an exception. So in the measure I am expecting exception, throws exception. In actual I am just calling a method fetch album with mock client we have. So now it should run successfully as expected. Okay, it runs. Now let's see, in the function we are using the 1 as an album id, but let's say I am using the 2 album id and I am running my test again on this class, but we are kind of mocking the only for one album. So I have just running the first test, so it should be failing because we are not getting any of those data for album number 2. We have only provided the access of album number 2. To fix this case we need to use the 2. So whenever our fetch album calls, it trying to access the album 2 and we are getting the data for this album 2. So this is the reason we need to use the same URL which we are using over here in the function. Okay, so I am just reverting those changes to keep everything in the same page. So we can run both the test cases and confirm it's working as expected or not. So this is the test cases using the Mockito and the mocking HTTP client for any of your needs, and we can convert this to like in such a way that we can just inject the client from the provider. So constructor, so I am just creating a class over here, class API provider, and here in this class I am creating the http dot client. Okay, and for this client I am creating the constructor, and constructor has a optional parameter, named parameter called required with required, and now we can move this function inside this API, and the API class we don't need to have a client over here as we are already have a client over here, so that's fine. And now we just need to refactor this using the API client. So I am just using this to, as we are repeating this kind of things, so we have a function called setup which will help us to create the things once. So I am just kind of using this let API provider as a class, and let http dot client, and now in the setup I am mocking the client, mock client, it's client, and then API provider is equals to API provider of this mock client we have. And now we are using the API provider dot fetch over here, we don't need to pass the client. Same over here, API provider dot fetch, we don't need to use the client, and we don't need to have this additional client as we have already the client. So now I am running these functions and it should run correctly as expected. So we are kind of keeping eye if it is running or not. Yes, our both tests are getting pass. Mock demo and throws the exception, but I think we can change the name of this test to like this one, returns an album if the HTTP call completes successfully.